By the mid-20th century, Jean-Paul Sartre had displaced the traditional model of human nature to construct a new philosophical anthropology. Since classical antiquity, most philosophical systems have operated on a single premise, that human beings possess a predetermined nature or essence. We find the roots of this in the foundational dialogues of Plato. In the Meno, for instance, virtue and knowledge are treated as innate forms that the human soul possesses before birth. Sartre argued that this model incorrectly treats human beings as if they were artifacts. If an artisan makes a paper knife, the concept and purpose of that knife exist in the artisan's mind before the object is produced. Classical philosophy assumed humans were similarly designed, whether by God or by nature, to fulfill a specific function. For human reality, Sartre argues that this formula is reversed. Existence precedes essence. This shift removes the concept of a stable human substance. The subject is no longer a static entity, but a continuous activity that must synthesize its own nature through its choices. Sartre's method began with the adoption of Husserl's principle of intentionality. This is the rule that all consciousness is consciousness of something. It is always directed toward an object outside itself. But Sartre rejected Husserl's use of the epoché, the suspension of the external world, and the transcendental ego. He argued that the ego is not a hidden source of consciousness located behind a bracket, but an object existing out in the world. He simultaneously adopted Heidegger's framework of being in the world. This placed consciousness directly into a concrete, unbrackenized environment. However, Sartre deviated from Heidegger by centering this environmental embeddedness on a radically subjective consciousness, a move Heidegger had sought to avoid by focusing on the broader manner of being. Through this synthesis, Sartre stripped consciousness of all internal substance. He reduced the mind to a pure, translucent appearance. By removing these internal structures, Sartre defined consciousness as a literal nothingness. It is a wind blowing toward the world, forming the basis for his dual ontology. Sartre's first mode of being is the en soi, the in itself. It is massive, opaque, without cause. It simply is. The second mode is the pour soi, the for itself. Human consciousness is an internal negation of the en soi. It is a lack of being. Because the pour soi lacks a fixed essence, it exists across three temporal ecstasies: facticity, its unalterable past; presence, its current relation; and transcendence, its future projection. The pour soi introduces a gap of non-being into the fullness of reality. Merleau-Ponty described this by calling man a flaw in the diamond of the world. The awareness of this structural lack of essence is experienced as anguish. It is the realization that the self has no foundation. Since the pour soi is separated from its past and future by this nothingness, its path is never fixed. It is condemned to freedom. Sartre illustrates how this nothingness is a lived phenomenon through his example of searching for his friend Pierre in a crowded café. The patrons, the furniture, and the noise are a massive fullness of being. This is the en soi, which is indifferent to the searcher. But the consciousness of the searcher organizes this environment around a specific expectation. The entire café becomes a background against which a singular lack is highlighted. Pierre's absence is not a late intellectual judgment. It is a real phenomenon, a localized void experienced directly by the subject. This shows that lack and absence are not properties of the physical universe. They are ontological structures brought into reality exclusively by human consciousness. This introduces the other. Sartre describes the look as an act that attempts to fix the free shifting pour soi into a static object. However, this model of isolated individuals proved insufficient for addressing the systemic realities of occupied Europe. In his later work, The Critique of Dialectical Reason, Sartre integrated his earlier philosophy of consciousness with Marxist historical materialism. He introduced the concept of praxis. Praxis is purposeful human action that operates on a material environment, primarily to overcome the condition of scarcity. Through praxis, the pour soi is redefined. It is an organic individual embedded in a dialectical relationship with nature and society. This shifted Sartrean anthropology from a study of subjective anguish to a framework for social theory. Within praxis, there is a dialectical trap. To survive, human beings must transform matter, but in doing so, they exteriorize their freedom into inanimate objects. Sartre calls this the practico inert. Worked matter turns back on its human creators, forcing workers to adapt their behavior to the machine's requirements. This leads to contra-finality. Praxis deployed against nature can produce unintended consequences, like deforestation causing floods, that eventually limit future human freedom. The practico inert creates social series. These groups, like people waiting for a bus, are physically adjacent but united only by an external object. In this system, material alienation overlays existential alienation. The subject is constrained by the industrial and historical structures they helped build. Sartre's analysis of material determinism provided the conceptual basis for the structuralist movement that followed. Structuralists like Levi-Strauss critiqued Sartre's focus on the individual, arguing the ultimate goal of the human sciences is not to constitute, but to dissolve man. These critics used Sartre's Marxist synthesis to argue that anonymous systems, not conscious subjects, are the true drivers of history. Sartre resisted, insisting the free, organic praxis of the individual remains the irreducible core of history. This tension became the defining battle of late 20th century continental philosophy, the sovereign subject versus the anonymous structure. Sartre attempted to preserve the individual subject through the progressive-regressive method. The regressive phase of this method accepts the structures of historical materialism, class and economics, as the baseline conditions of life. But the progressive phase adds existential psychoanalysis, necessary to understand how an individual creatively surpasses those conditions. Sartre illustrated this by noting that while the poet Paul Valéry is a petit bourgeois intellectual, not every petit bourgeois intellectual is Valéry. Sartre's final Anthropology presents human reality as a restless totalization. We are forever constrained by our environment, yet capable of surpassing what we are made into. Despite the weight of history and the practico inert, the nothingness of consciousness ensures that humanity remains condemned to be free.